I am a commissioner with CREA, the Hartford Commission on Refugee and Immigrant Affairs. My day job is with Catholic Charities. Catholic Charities operates based on the social teachings of the Catholic Church. Any immigration issues are addressed within the framework of fundamental moral principles that flow from both faith and reason. To quote Archbishop Leonard Blair of the Archdiocese of Hartford, we assist all who are vulnerable and fleeing persecution, regardless of their religion. People have a right to a decent life in their own homeland, but if that fails, people also have the right to migrate to support themselves and their families, just as so many of our ancestors did. Sovereign nations like the United States have to control their own borders, but this does not abolish the duty every country has, not only to grant asylum to the persecuted and to war refugees, but also to respect the basic human dignity and human rights of every immigrant. Catholic Charities USA resettles approximately 30% of the refugees that arrive in the United States. And the refugee resettlement network includes over 100 diocesan offices across the country and in Guam and Puerto Rico. This is not, of course, a solo effort. We rely heavily on volunteers and resources within the community and parishes. In the state of Connecticut, Catholic Charities usually resettles between 330 and 350 refugees yearly. But since the executive order, the refugee admittance has been reduced to 50,000 yearly, and the projection for us in Connecticut for the current fiscal year has been reduced to 155. To date, we have resettled 148 refugees from Somalia, Ethiopia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Burma, Bhutan, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, and Pakistan. We help these refugees resettle once they come to Connecticut, and we also help them with their immigration issues, helping them file for citizenship, their green cards, resettle their families, or sponsor their families to come in, and other related immigration issues. Thank you.
My name is Joyce Antila Phipps. I'm the director at Casa Esperanza in Brown Brook. Brown Brook is a small little town in the middle of New Jersey. In 2016, the Border Patrol apprehended approximately about 60,000 unaccompanied minors and about 78,000 what they call family units, women and children primarily, seeking refuge in the United States. These are not admitted refugees. These are people who are coming across the border because they're running for their lives. They're running for their lives from gangs, from domestic violence, and anything that you can even begin to imagine. All of the horrors in what we call the Northern Triangle. And we work with them, trying to get them status in the United States. We represent people, a ton of kids, more kids than I can begin to count, and in immigration court and with USCIS. But the other important thing that we do is we work with the kids and with the families after they've been hopefully gotten their legal status. We do workshops teaching them how to live in the United States, how to relate in a different culture. We had a wonderful little arts workshop for teenagers last Saturday. We had 20 kids drawing pictures of their trips, and those are very interesting. The other important thing that we do is we work with a lot of undocumented people who have been here and who are very frightened of being deported. And in this day and age, that's a realistic possibility if you don't have status. So one of the things that we've been trying to help people do is to prepare, to think ahead, to be able to plan for their lives if they end up getting picked up by ICE or if they end up with an old final order of removal and they don't have much time to make any plans. And one of the things that you have in front of you is this little sheet of, the first is the yellow sheet of paper, and then the white sheet of paper. It's in Spanish. Most of our clients are Spanish-speaking. And if you give me your cards, I'm very happy to email any of this information, and you can just stick your own letterhead on top. But we try to help people plan ahead. We try to help people think about what is really involved. We've been doing workshops on powers of attorney, where it all started when I had to go to a jail and talk to a woman who was signing over her kid because she did not want her child to die of starvation, because that's what she expected would happen if that child ended up in Guatemala.
Hi, my name's John Bauer, and I come from about 200 yards that way, a UConn Law School, which used to be where the Hartford Seminary was located. For about the past 15 years, I've been directing a program at the law school called the Asylum and Human Rights Clinic, which is a program in which law students work intensively on cases on behalf of asylum seekers in immigration court and in the Department of Homeland Security's Asylum Office. It might be worth just taking a moment to explain some terminology, because Joyce and I both work with asylum seekers. Asylum seekers are refugees in the sense that they're people who meet the definition of a refugee, which you heard about earlier, but asylum is distinct from the refugee resettlement program, through which the United States takes in a set number of refugees from outside the U.S. each year and resettles them in the U.S. In contrast to that, asylum seekers are people who have presented themselves at the border or already made it into the U.S., whether on a valid visa or by crossing the border without authorization, and are asking for the right to remain here because they fear persecution if sent back to their home country. And although the U.S. is not obliged to take in refugees from abroad, it is certainly an important moral obligation of countries to do that, but not a legal obligation. Under the Refugee Convention, once a person presents themselves at the border or makes it into the country, they have a right to apply for asylum and cannot be sent back if they can show that they have a well-founded fear of being persecuted because of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. The clients my program represent come from all parts of the world, the Northern Triangle of Central America. Many of our clients recently come from there, but also the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, South America, and the Caribbean. Some have fled their home countries because of persecution based on their religion, some based on their political beliefs. Others are fleeing gender-based kinds of violence like female genital cutting or domestic violence or honor killings. Some face violence because of their LGBT status, and some are fleeing threats from gangs and drug cartels. One other thing my program has been involved in for the last couple of years is a spring break program that brings volunteer law students and social work students and faculty from the law and social work schools, as well as volunteer attorneys, down to an immigration detention center in York, Pennsylvania, where students work with a very vulnerable and underrepresented population, detained asylum seekers. Maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk more about that later.
Hi, so I'm Antila. I work for Accentria Care Alliance, and Accentria used to be Lutheran Social Services of New England, in case you are wondering, like, what the heck is Accentria? By the way, that's the word Ascension and Trinity merged together. We got creative about how to keep our faith roots but become very open. Speaking of the conversation today, being Lutheran was too narrow, especially considering who we resettle. So we do resettlement amongst a bunch of other things. So we really have services from the beginning of life all the way to the end. So we have nursing homes and we have adoption and foster care. In the area of this resettlement, we do probably the most broad cut of this type of work of anyone in the United States. So we have the largest resettlement agency in New England, so we resettle both in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. We did probably 1,100 or so last year. And that's a mix of people from all over the world, from places you'd expect and places you wouldn't, like places around Russia are some of the largest folks coming into Springfield, believe it or not. We also do a lot of unaccompanied refugee kids. That's coming from overseas, but also coming in through the southern borders, and they're coming in with a different kind of status. They're not refugees yet, but we work with them in our legal program to get them to refugee status, although that takes some time. So we have lots of kids coming in through that way, and we have kids coming in from overseas that do not have parents with them. So we do lots of services that way, as well as doing primary resettlement. It's a pretty fascinating time to be doing this work, and we'll talk in a little while about why there's lots of reasons to hope, but there's lots of reasons to act too. This is an unprecedented time in so many ways, some of it being very good. Referring to the earlier, this environment creates a lot of activity, and I will tell you we've gotten more phone calls and more requests to do something than I've seen the whole time that we've been there. And that's from all kinds of churches and all kinds of people and all kinds of walks of life that think that this is not acceptable. And I think that's great because it creates the opportunity to create a new conversation and a new end to an old story. So hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about some of that. And we'll just share that one. There you go. We'll just keep going.
So I'm the I got it.
It was coming down, so I just had it.
2 mics.
Doubly special.
I'm the director of a refugee resettlement agency called IRIS. It stands for Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services. We're based in New Haven. In 1982, we were established by the Episcopal Diocese of Connecticut. But over the past 10 years, we have turned ourselves into an organization that is much more inclusive and open to just about anyone who wants to help refugees. And it's worked well. We changed our name to a more generic name from Interfaith Refugee Ministry to Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services, and we're working with not just churches, but mosques and synagogues and Rotary clubs and used car dealerships to welcome refugees. You all remember about 2 years ago, summer of 2015, support and sympathy for refugees was probably at an all-time high. It was for me in my 12 years of working in refugee resettlement. Never was there more of an outcry to help refugees. There were the terrorist attacks in Paris in November, and support plummeted, even though refugees had nothing to do with that. Before we knew it, there were 30 governors across the United States who were saying, we don't want to welcome Syrian refugees. But not in Connecticut. Governor in Connecticut and the communities and individuals stepped forward and said, you don't want them in those states? Send them here. We want to welcome them. Over my first 10 years, an average of 1 or 2 community groups would step forward and say, we want to be a co-sponsor of a refugee family. IRIS, we want you to train us and then place a family in our community, and we'll do everything from A to Z under your supervision. 1 or 2 groups a year over my first 10 years. Over the past 2 years, 60 community groups have stepped forward. Coalitions, interfaith coalitions, individual churches, synagogues from the greater New Haven area have already welcomed 3 refugee families. A Muslim couple from Syria needed to remarry in this country in order to have a legal marriage license. They were married in a synagogue by a Christian priest 2 weeks ago. You see why I think I've got the best job in the world? What does a refugee resettlement agency do? Well, it usually begins with an email that comes in, and it says, you've got 2 weeks, and I've got 30 seconds. You've got 2 weeks to prepare for and welcome a refugee family. They're coming in 2 weeks, so we have to run out, find an apartment. We furnish it with donated furniture. We stock the kitchen with food. We find someone in the neighborhood who can cook a culturally appropriate hot meal. That's a U.S. government requirement. I know you expressed surprise. You'll never criticize the U.S. government again, right? It's a federal requirement. Within 2 hours of a refugee's arrival, they must be served a culturally appropriate hot meal. We get all of that ready. They arrive. We meet them at the airport. If it's cold, we bundle them up, again, in used clothing that you all have generously donated. We take them to their apartment. They have that hot meal, a good night's sleep. The next day, we bring them into the office. This is happening all over the country as I speak. The next day, we bring them into the office. We sit them down at a table, and we say, we're going to help you get the health care you need, first things first. We're going to enroll your kids in school. We're going to help you learn English, and we're going to help you get a job. And it is amazing. It works. It takes some families a little longer than others, but it is an amazing program, probably our finest foreign policy, strengthens the economy, diversifies our communities. Statue of Liberty is our symbol. Albert Einstein is our poster child. Why would anyone want to mess with this program?
So if you want to go to the conference overview on the website, the Luce-Hartford conference schedule, you just hit the link and that'll take you directly to each of their organizations and what they do so that you can begin networking with them. So I'm going to ask them one question to start out, but now that you've heard them introduce themselves, now's your time to begin writing your questions, and our students will come by and pick up those cards from you. So, for the panel, to start things off, what I would like to ask is, how has the narrative, the larger political context in the United States in the last 4 months, specifically with the 2 executive orders relating to refugee resettlement and immigration enforcement, affected your work?
Well, let's see. 3 weeks ago, ICE decided they wanted to show their strength, so they decided they walked into a Walmart in a little town called North Brunswick, New Jersey. The Walmart was full of people, and they just started picking out everybody who looked Hispanic. And they rounded up like 40 people and started asking them for their papers. I mean, I thought the last time you got asked for your papers was in some film about Nazi Germany. That's how it's affected my work.
Well, I can certainly talk about ours. So, just so, are you all familiar with what the executive orders did? Tried to do? So, let me just give you a 50,000-foot view. That last year, the president determines every fall on October 1st how many refugees and from where the U.S. will accept. And over the past few years, that number's been rising. Last year was around 85,000, give or take, in total, and the executive order was for 110,000. So all of our agencies began preparing to see an influx of even more people than we had last year, and last year was a pretty high year. And our region of the country gets a lot of them. Massachusetts in general is quite high in terms of where refugees go. In the United States, Massachusetts takes a big chunk of them. In any case, we were shocked, when certainly as everybody was, when we saw the results of the presidential election and knew that that was going to mean something related to immigration, but no one knew what. And I think I speak probably for all of us that no one anticipated that early on in the cycle there would be such a draconian measure that said 3 things primarily. One was they were going to cut the number of refugees more than in half, down to 50,000 cap. At the time that was issued, 37,000 had already arrived. So if you think about the end of January, we had a very aggressive early part of the year. A lot of arrivals, a lot of our agencies had been really overworked, arguably, coming into January, and then it looked like it was coming to a complete halt. And they said there was going to be a 4-month hiatus where there would be no refugees at all while they checked the vetting program, as if that isn't already aggressive enough, but that no one would get any refugees for 4 months, period, and that you couldn't get refugees or wouldn't allow refugees for at least 90 days for 6 countries, and the 7th, Syria, would be none at all. Now, most of the countries that were on the list, Iraq included, are places we've been resettling for over 10 years. And we'd even resettled Syrian refugees, and I'm sure many of you have as well. So it was a massive blow to everyone, saying, okay, so the programs are just stopping, and what about people that are in transit? What about people that are approved to fly? What about families that are split up right now? We had part families in the US and part people overseas. We had people that were supposed to arrive on planes, and you saw what happened in the airports and all of that. But that only is the surface of what that actually did, because the whole program came to a screeching halt, because the State Department, my opinion, was told not to process anymore. So what happens is that vetting process takes like 2 years. So for everything to come together, there's only about a 30-day window that you can actually resettle somebody before some of that stuff starts expiring, and you have to start the whole process over again. And so we were hurtling up to the point where, okay, we're supposed to be resettling people, and now we're resettling no one. And we're not sure. So then the first executive order was blocked, but it didn't include provisions specifically for the refugee program. It only was really attacking that it was a Muslim ban, and so they were really attacking the language that said where people were coming from, but not so much the refugee program in general, which left all of us in limbo. Then they came back with a second order that softened the language a little, but not really, and took Iraq off the list of blocked because of the special immigrant visas for Iraqi folks that helped us in Iraq. But then it got blocked again. And so we're still in a position of blocked. So refugees are arriving now. The reprocessing started again probably 6 weeks ago, maybe. And so we've started to see the numbers coming back through. I was in Washington last week. I understand that in the appropriations, they finally approved a budget through September, which was a miracle. And in that budget is actually appropriations for, I think, 85,000 total, not 50. However, it is totally unclear. It is yay. But it is totally unclear what the heck we're supposed to expect. They did up the number of people they're allowing to arrive, but it's hard. We had to cut staff. I know most of the people across resettlement agencies had to lay off staff because you can't plan on people that you don't know if they're going to arrive or not. So now we're getting hit because we're trying to resettle people we don't have staff for. So it's a really tough time to be here, and a lot of advocacy efforts going on right now to try and combat what's happening.
So in addition to the travel ban and refugee resettlement executive order, which with justification has received a huge amount of public attention, there were 2 other somewhat less noticed immigration executive orders issued by President Trump in January, one relating to border security and one relating to interior immigration enforcement. And these actually are having a huge effect. Some of it felt already, some of it kind of the shadow of things yet to come for asylum seekers in several ways. It's making it more difficult for people to access asylum in the United States. It's imposing more punitive conditions, including detention, on people who seek asylum. And there's also a real hostility towards NGOs and legal services organizations trying to help asylum seekers in terms of access to the asylum process. The United States already has something pretty awful called expedited removal, which is a process by which if someone comes to a border crossing or comes to an airport, if they don't have proper documentation, they can be sort of summarily sent back to their country with very little process, no right to see a lawyer, no right to see an immigration judge or get a hearing. And over time, that process was extended to people caught near the border, people who crossed illegally and were caught within 100 miles of the border within 14 days after entering. In theory, people who get into this expedited removal process, if they express a fear of harm in their home country, they're supposed to be taken out of this quick return expedited removal process. They're supposed to be given an interview by a U.S. asylum officer. And if the asylum officer finds that they have some credible claim for asylum, then they get to stay in the U.S. and have a full hearing in front of an immigration judge to seek asylum. Now, the problem with that is it's in theory, because the Border Patrol folks, nobody is watching them, and they're supposed to ask, are you afraid of being sent back? Often they don't ask. And even when people do say they're afraid, often the Border Patrol doesn't write that down and sends them right back anyway. Several studies, including a recent one from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom that observed some of these proceedings, found that it's quite regular for people to get sent back, even though they expressed a fear of persecution. So that's the current bad news. In the worst bad news in the executive orders is that they call for a massive expansion of expedited removal so that it will, in the future, if this is carried through, be applied to anyone who's picked up by ICE anywhere in the U.S. Without proper papers, unless the person can prove that they've already been in the country for at least 2 years. So we may be seeing a massive expansion of people who are denied effective access to be able to apply for asylum because they're just in these secret proceedings without any real hearing. People are refusing to listen to their fear and instead sending them straight back. In terms of detention, the executive orders also call for greatly increased detention of asylum seekers. It's already the case that, in theory, people who are caught at or near the border who apply for asylum can be kept in detention while their cases are being heard, and that could be months or sometimes years before they get to a hearing in front of an immigration judge. But it's been the practice since 2009 that once a person makes it through the initial screening with an asylum officer who finds that they have a sort of non-frivolous claim for asylum, they're usually released and allowed to pursue their asylum claim not in detention. That is changing. Although ICE has discretion to release detained asylum seekers on bond, it's now become routine that they refuse to set any bond. Sometimes an immigration judge can review that and may decide to release the person, but it's getting harder for people to get released from detention. And that, has a number of consequences. First of all, it's terribly traumatic for people who have fled from situations of extreme violence, who may have been imprisoned in their home countries, to be kept in detention here when they're seeking freedom in the United States. A lot of these folks suffer from depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Their conditions are made much worse by being held in detention. In the last couple of weeks, there have been a couple of deaths in immigration detention, including someone who committed suicide in an immigration detention center in Georgia. And it makes it very hard for people to get legal representation. A lot of the detention facilities are in rural areas, places where there are not a lot of lawyers located. A recent report found that only 14% of detained immigrants get lawyers to help them with their immigration hearings. When people are not in detention, about 2/3 manage to get lawyers. And in asylum cases, people with lawyers are 4 to 6 times more likely to be granted asylum than people without lawyers. So let me stop there.
The other thing that's really important to realize is because of the way ICE has expanded its, shall we say, its purview, that it's also now decided that the place to pick up people, let's look at low-hanging fruit. One area of low-hanging fruit happened to be courts. And in fact, in Texas, a woman who went in to get a protective order against an abusive U.S. citizen husband was picked up in the courthouse. Now, we've had Chief Justice Ratner, who's the Chief Justice in New Jersey and also the Chief Justice in California, and now New York has said to ICE, hey, stay out of the courthouses. And ICE has basically said, no, we're going to go into the courthouses. And the point is, of course, what there's now having is that you've had a 40% drop in the number of women who are filing domestic violence complaints. Are you surprised? No. The abusive husband, goes and calls ICE on the abused wife. I mean, it happens all the time. And the victim ends up getting detained and usually sometimes separated from the children, which is also another traumatic kind of event. It's also important to realize that as John Bauer said, very few people in detention have lawyers. Look at a map and figure out where Dilley, Texas is, which is one of the largest detention centers for women and children. Dilley, Texas is surrounded by approximately 200 miles of, we'll be polite and call it land. It's about a good 4-hour ride from the nearest thing that looks like a town, and almost all of these places are private prisons. They're run by GEO and they're run by CCA, and they are not held to the same standards as people in the U.S. Bureau of Prisons are held to. They are not held to the same standards. That means that they don't have to give the same kind of medical care. That's why we have suicides in some of these prisons. That's why you have all kinds of deaths as a result of illness, because they are not held to the same standards. On top of that, now, and fortunately, a district court just overturned this, actually it's a circuit court now, that overturned this attempt by ICE to try to limit access to legal services. They went after a couple of nonprofit agencies, Catholic Charities was among them, up in the northwest area of the country, and went after them and said, well, you're not representing people in immigration court, you don't have a right to know your rights presentations, you don't have a right to give any kind of legal advice, you don't have a right to give any kind of assistance. And Northwest Immigrant Justice Coalition went to court and got that attempt by ICE to restrict legal access. These people are not nice people, would be a polite way to put it. They are out to deport as many people as they can in whatever manner they want. And in fact, in New Jersey, we had this experience yesterday of somebody who is being deported back to Indonesia, and he had a really bad experience there with a fringe group called FPI, and this is happening all over the country, and the access is being restricted. These places are being put out in the middle of nowhere, and ICE is out there just to work its muscle. And also, as John said, the lack of supervision of the Border Patrol is criminal. You should look at these, what are they called, I-213s? They're the forms that the Border Patrol fills out on a person when they come in, or when they're picked up. So one of my clients, who is an autistic, nonverbal, 14-year-old boy, whose mother had been murdered in Honduras 6 months before, what did I say? Wants to join his mother in New Jersey. I mean, get real. I mean, it is just outrageous what's going on. And tomorrow, a very important day for Haitians. The question is whether or not Haitians are going to be permitted to maintain their temporary protected status. And the Haitians, and now we're looking at we're looking at people from Somalia, Sudan, and Liberia, and Sierra Leone. What's going to happen to them? I mean, this is a really draconian attempt to make America white again.
The Haitians, I just read an email today. It has been extended till January 2018, the temporary protected status.
It was
Came out
extended.
today, yes.
It was extended, so they got it. Okay.
Only to January 2018.
But only to
January 2018, yes. 22nd of January 2018.
7 months.
Okay, for Catholic Charities, the effect that has had, we've had to lay off employees as well, because We depend on funding and grants, and since our refugee resettlement numbers have been reduced, we had to lay off staff. The second consequence of the executive orders is the fear among the community. Our refugees who are here legally, they get their green cards after being here for 1 year. When they get their green cards, they can only apply after 1 year. When they get their green cards, the green card, the date is backdated to when they first came in, but they don't actually have the green card in hand. So we have our legally arrived, assimilated refugees come to us and say, are they going to send us back? Is President Trump going to send us back now? My son or my daughter is still in Somalia, in Iraq, in wherever. Will they ever be able to join us? Will we ever be able to see them again? Now, these are the people that have already been traumatized, and they're going through all this all over again. But some good news. There's a lot of negative news, but I'm veering off the topic a little bit, but it's good news, so I'd like to share it with you. There was a press conference this morning. The mayor and a few city officials finally announced what is called the Municipal ID Program for Hartford. Kriya, we've been working for it for a long time, so yes. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the Municipal ID Program. It means that anybody and everybody can apply for and get the municipal ID irrespective of their immigration status, which means a lot of people who are here illegally can apply for the municipal ID card and can access city services, libraries, and most importantly, interact with the police, okay, legally. Now, at Kriya, we've been working with the community, and just last week we had invited the mayor and the chief of police. At least in Hartford, there are some positive things. The chief of police, we had a cross-section of the community attend our meeting. Among them were a few illegal people as well, people without documents, and they felt comfortable to ask the chief of police questions, talking about abuse, domestic violence. These people are afraid to contact the police because they feel the police would ask them for their immigration status. But the chief of police convinced them and told them that the police here in Hartford is there to help them and will never question their immigration status. And the chief of police later told us at Kriya that he would be willing to go out into the community and talk to these people to allay their fears. And we are going to follow up on that and have the chief of police go and speak with these people so that they feel comfortable and are able to contact the police. So that's some good news.
So that was just one question.
Can I say something?
Yes, he
I didn't respond to that question.
I'm sorry. So we're still in the middle of the first question.
Yeah. So I just want to repeat what Angela said, just so you understand the impact of this. Last year, at the United Nations, the President of the United States made a commitment to the world that we would resettle 110,000 refugees, that we would welcome 110,000 refugees, which is already a pathetically low amount given the crisis in the world, the greatest since World War II, and our role as a leader in refugee resettlement. And more importantly, it was a commitment to 110,000 refugees. Virtually all of them had gone through the vetting process and were ready for that final step of having places assigned and travel dates assigned. New President of the United States reneges on that agreement. It is just unacceptable. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that the executive orders, these horrible executive orders, the first one and the revised one, have really only been in effect in their entirety for a matter of days. Thank God for our independent judiciary. Both have been stopped practically in their tracks. Refugees have been coming since January 27th, except for a few days. We've been resettling refugees. Other refugee resettlement agencies have been welcoming them. And just remember what Angela said a few minutes ago, and the budget that would allow us to bring 85,000 refugees was passed 2 weeks ago. So there is a legal opening to resettle 85,000 and a budget to resettle 85,000 refugees this year. There's no excuse for us not to do that. We're at 45,000 now, and you might think, oh my God, but that's 40,000 over the next 4 months. That's what we did last year. So if we did it last year, we could do it again this year. So get ready. You're going to be pummeled by all kinds of advocacy emails asking you to join in with our voice, supporting our message to Congress, to Washington. We need to bring as many refugees as we can possibly bring this year. Who knows what's going to happen next year? But this fiscal year, there's no excuse for us not to bring 85,000. The ones who do all the work are ready for it. That's the agencies represented here. You'll hire staff, in a matter of days. We're poised and ready to resettle refugees. So we have to make that argument to Washington.
One quick comment related to that. Refugee resettlement has always been a bipartisan issue until recently. This separation is new. Refugees have always had joint support from both sides of the aisle. It's only been recently when essentially, and this is a religious argument that's causing this problem, hence the reason we're having this conversation, because if they were, and even in the executive orders, there was language that essentially said, but if you're Christian, you'll get prioritization.
Oh, yeah, wow.
Which was total crap. That was in the first round. Sorry, that's not exactly professional, but whatever. And you're taping me, that's even better. But the fact of the matter is, it was only when people started making an issue out of the fact that the people we're resettling are often Muslim, and the Syrian refugees were the ones that sort of tipped that over, and it started becoming this partisan issue that it's never been. And I will say some of our biggest supporters are employers, because there's a huge crisis in the workforce right now. There are not enough employees in the United States right now to do what needs to be done, and especially in this region, we have seriously low unemployment, and there's a lot of people, including our own organizations, looking for employees. And so one thing I can tell you is use that line. You can get to the other side of the aisle easier if you talk about it as economic development than you can if you start pushing this sort of safety humanitarian issue. It doesn't go very far with some people that sort of stuck their feet in the ground and decided that this is real, but you can come around the other side and have a different argument. It works a lot better. Just a hint.
I think you've already answered this one, but I'll pose it. This is to everyone. And the questioner has channeled Dr. Luce by using quotes. So what are your thoughts on the real reasons why we have restrictions on refugees right now?
Well, in a word, it's fear.
Yeah, I think that during the campaign, people running for public office felt that it would be convenient to have a boogeyman, someone to blame our problems on, stoking fear, stereotyping, and I guess it worked.
Right.
But all of the research, all of the testimonies, all of the evidence shows that refugees and immigrants in general make this country stronger.
Well, and safer, specifically. So it's not just refugee, the link between refugee and terrorism is zip. It doesn't exist. It really doesn't exist. And what we've been told about the communities that we resettle in is they are safer. There are less crime when we have resettled refugees or asylees or immigrants in them than if they did not. So the police departments are our friends and our advocates and supporters of our work. So it's not just theory, but there's a lot of evidence to say that this is not true. So one thing I can also say is we have to change the narrative. We have to put truth out there and start really pushing out a different narrative to change this fear-based, but they're going to kill us problem, because that's what people are worried about.
Can I just add one more thing? And when you're choosing a scapegoat, you pick people who don't have a huge amount of support. This country barely realized we had a refugee resettlement program until it hit the headlines 2 years ago. And that's our fault. we have not done enough outreach, public education. We haven't gone out and engaged the communities and the public in refugee resettlement so you would understand the process, know that there's extreme vetting, have a general picture of the global crisis, and then meet face-to-face real refugees. If you've done that, you'll support the program. Too few Americans have, and now we're playing catch-up.
Yeah, I think that fear goes a long way, especially when people don't think that they've ever met anybody who fits a certain category. And and they've had these images painted. You know, we've gone through a year and a half of campaigning where Mexicans are rapists, Muslims are terrorists, and, you know, and anything else that doesn't look white and all that good, haven't been here for the last 300 years, doesn't belong here. I mean, we've gone through this kind of terrible, hate-filled speech. And quite frankly, I think the churches bear a great deal of responsibility for not owning up to dealing with some of these issues. Because when a church faces that kind of language in their community, and the church leadership and the people in the church who go around calling themselves good Christians, Jews, or whatever, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and they don't speak to that issue, then that's very sad. We have a program in New Jersey called Stand Up for the Other. It was started by Dr. Ali Chaudhry, and what we do is we take a pledge to stand up for the other, the person who's out there that we may not know, and that person who is not part of what we see as our exclusive narrative. But we stand up for the other because, quite frankly, someday the other may be us. And that's something that people need to think about. You know, that old statement by Martin Niemöller, I think it was Niemöller who said, you know, first they came for this and I wasn't one of those, and then they came for that and I wasn't one of that. But then they finally came for me and there was no one left to stand up for me. The churches need to take responsibility, the synagogues take responsibility, and so do the mosques need to take responsibility, as well as all of the other religious bodies. They need to speak as religious people on these issues. After 2001, the Immigration and Naturalization Service was split into two groups. One was called the Department of Homeland Security, and the other one was called United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. USCIS is the one that handles all of the, what they call the benefit applications, getting your green card, getting your citizenship, getting yourself from asylee or refugee status into a status that leads ultimately towards citizenship. The other one is the Department of Homeland Security, which includes ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has below it certain groups called ERO, for instance, and DDO, which is Deportation, Expedited Removal, all kinds of organizations. They're given their power originally by Congress, and then those powers are delegated to the administrative agencies. And the administrative agencies then issue various regulations, and those, in some cases, those regulations, I think, are fairly broad. And then in some cases, there just isn't the adequate supervision.
So let me just add, the State Department plays an important role in refugee resettlement, in working with other agencies to set the number of refugees the United States will take over the course of a coming year. They have, along with the Department of Homeland Security, involvement in designating priority groups for refugee resettlement, and then the Department of Homeland Security is involved with individualized screening of refugees overseas. And I think Joyce gave a good overview of the internal architecture of this very complicated immigration bureaucracies in the U.S. The Department of Justice also has important responsibilities. They run the immigration courts, and the Attorney General can decide many important issues relating to how the immigration laws are interpreted. And that is a cause for worry because the current Attorney General, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, has some very extreme views that are anti-immigrant, anti-asylum seeker, and that may, over time, play out in the way the law gets interpreted by the Department of Justice. I just want to say that not all ICE agents are bad people, although Joyce may disagree. In Connecticut, I know there are people working for ICE who do not share the president's views, who have no great enthusiasm for going out and doing raids. They may face pressure from higher ups in ICE to get out there and do more raids. But it's complicated. Even Dr. Even Dr. Seuss, who many of us idolize, in the 1940s, he did some political cartoons for newspapers in favor of Japanese internment. So, people can have both progressive and regressive attitudes.
I don't know this offhand, so I'm going to read it. I had noted this down. The United States Refugee Admissions Program, USRAP, USRAP, is comprised of the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration, BRM, of the United States Department of State, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, of the Department of Homeland Security, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, 5 international or non-governmental organizations operating resettlement support centers around the world under the supervision and funding of the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration, PRM, of the U.S. Department of State, 9 domestic non-governmental organizations with a total of about 350 affiliated offices across the United States, and of course thousands of private citizens who volunteer their time and skills to help refugees resettle in the United States.
Those are a lot of offices.
There's a bit of an image you might want to know. Every Wednesday, and this is at the State Department, so this is where PRM is, so it's in Washington, those 9 voluntary agencies that do resettlement in the United States, and that most of them are religious. So HIAS is the Jewish one, and U.S. Catholic Charities, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Resettlement, Episcopal Migration, Church World Service, and there's a couple more that I'm missing, doesn't matter. They actually get together and they review and pick. I call it the Russian roulette of who gets to come to the U.S. By the way, the people coming don't get to pick the country they come to. So if you ever wanted to come here as a way to sort of be a terrorist or something, that would be a really stupid idea since you don't get to choose if this is your end country. We choose you. So every week, every Wednesday, they will pick based on who they think they can best resettle. So they have a number that's allotted to each of the agencies, the larger agencies, that picks every week and says we can take this one and 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 this one. And if they have U.S. ties, which most of them do, so refugees that are coming to the U.S., most of the time have a connection to somebody who's here. They will often be resettled with the agency that is closest to the geography where the person is. So if they have a relative in Worcester, we're the largest resettlement agency in Worcester, so the chances are pretty good that if you came in with a U.S. tie to Worcester and got picked out of the little roulette wheel every week, you will probably end up being resettled by our agency. But again, the refugee has nothing to say about any of that. They don't get to pick where they go in the U.S., they don't get to pick what country they go to, and every week, there's no assurance that their name's gonna get drawn out of that hat in the first place. It's quite the process, so the U.S. decides where they come from, and who comes, and when they come, or if they come. So when these conversations happen at the Thanksgiving table where they say we're getting overrun with people and the images of people just running over the border, I assure you it doesn't look anything like that.
Okay, Okay, we have a number of questions related to what can we do. So here's a very good question. What are the best strengths that a group who wants to sponsor a family or refugees needs to have? And what are the financial requirements or arrangements needed to help?
I can talk about this. So, community co-sponsorship is really a very old traditional way of welcoming refugees. Groups, faith-based groups, families getting together to welcome refugees is the way most refugees were welcomed before 1982 when the current structure was created. So most of the faith-based groups have continued to use this co-sponsorship model, but until recently, there weren't a lot of groups that would step forward. But the interest in helping refugees has skyrocketed, and this is a way that you can do it. So we look for an organization that has person power, that is a committee of at least 20 people. We look for a group that is committed and smart. By smart, I mean they understand the objective of this program, which is to help a refugee family become self-sufficient, regain control over their lives, not to build dependency, not to smother them with financial assistance, not to hold the little kids on your lap and take care of them for months and months and months. The idea is to help a refugee family become self-sufficient. The biggest problem I have with community co-sponsors is they want to do too much for too long. And that is a problem. We have already placed 40 refugee families with community groups in Connecticut. It is spectacular what's happening in the state. And we think that this can be replicated across the country. If every state had this kind of outpouring of community interest and actually experience in welcoming refugees, I think there'd be much more pushback against the executive orders in Washington. So we want it replicated, and the only way it's going to be replicated is if it's affordable. So when I've got a group in Greenwich that wants to spend $30,000 on one family, I say no. We want the family to regain control over their lives, to get a job, to live in a place that they can afford to pay the rent. We can't allow the group to do too much for too long. So that's what I look for, a group that gets it, a group that is smart, a group that is applying the principles that we have taught them in our training program. Am I sounding too dogmatic or harsh? No? It makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, there are refugee agencies, some of them represented at the table here, who do not use community groups because they don't have the control they feel they need. And there are some days when I see what groups are doing, I sometimes wonder about this program, but not for very long. It is by far the best way for a refugee family to start a new life in this country, is to have a community group welcome them that has been trained by a refugee resettlement agency and supervised and overseen by that agency during the course of the assistance.
And I would just add a couple of specifics to that, because we have sponsorship programs too in various areas. Often they're churches that do it. There's been a couple of mistakes that I've seen along the way. If the group is too small, like one family cannot be matched with one family. It's too much of a burden on the one family, either the giver or the receiver. It just doesn't work. You need a larger group than that. You need to be specific about the boundaries that you're drawing on what people can and can't do, and not just so much the money. But what I will say that I have seen is this up-down theory. And let me just expound on that for a second, because we're rooting it out of our own agency too, because I think it's trained into people that I I'm gonna save you. Therein lies the problem underneath a whole lot of what's going on in this country right now. No, you're not gonna save anyone. You're gonna walk alongside somebody to where they want to go. You're not going to put your own definition of whatever that means. You know, if you think it's a white picket fence and a car and a dog and 1.8 kids or whatever it is you've decided in your mind is correct, and you assign that to somebody else as success for somebody else, you've failed automatically. And so I think when you talk about sort of training and setting expectations, it's really looking at people across. You know, if you can get people to see each other as valuable and as human beings that can control and dictate their own life, and if you're lucky enough to walk alongside them, then what a blessing it is for you and hopefully them too. But I think what we've had to do is retrain a lot of our case management staff, because they're used to all these lists and checklists, and this is how it's done, and I'm gonna tell you what to do, and when you finish that list, you know, you'll move along. And families and communities that wanna dole out so that they feel better about themselves. And that doesn't work. And so what I would say is going into it, looking at somebody saying, how can I walk with you to where you wanna go? And that requires a whole sort of mind shift to get it to really work.
Can I ask specifically about the financial needs of a refugee family, or what's required financially for them as they're getting on their feet? Starting with the tickets here.
Well, once a refugee family's been told they're going to come to the United States, they are asked to sign a promissory note to cover the cost of their airfare. The United States does not cover the cost of airfare for refugees to come here. I know that might sound a little shocking. Family's been living in a refugee camp in Jordan for 4 years. They haven't been allowed to work. They tried to work, and maybe they were, you know, stopped and arrested by the Jordanian police. They have gone deep into debt. They lost all of their assets in their home country. How can you possibly ask them to pay their way? Well, sorry, welcome to America. You've got to cover your airfare. When they arrive, a refugee gets a whopping $950 as a one-time welcome to America gift. They call it the welcome money. So a family of 5 gets 5 times that. The Refugee Resettlement Agency that's resettling the refugee also gets roughly the same amount to cover all of our costs. That is really the only assured, the only guaranteed financial assistance they get, special to the refugee program when they arrive. They're also eligible for food stamps, they're eligible for cash assistance, they're eligible for 8 months of health care, and then the Refugee Resettlement Agency will compete for some other government grants to make some more money available for this family and for its staff, and then maybe raise some private money to bridge that gap. The gap is when the federal dollars run out, which is after 1, 2, 3 months, and when the family is able to make enough money to cover their expenses. There's almost always a gap. Our job is to find other money somewhere to cover that gap. But refugees, you know, when you go home tonight and tomorrow you're chatting with friends, is, oh, why are we lavishing so much money on these foreigners? We've got our own people to help. Well, we are not. It is a modestly funded program, and we really don't have enough money, even if we wanted to help these families much more than what their basic needs are.
Well, and depending on where they come from, their needs can be really, really, really different. So the one thing that's a problem is we've all lumped refugees into this pile as if they're all the same. They could not be more different. I tell you, a woman coming from the Democratic Republic of the Congo is likely to be alone. She's likely to be illiterate. She probably can't read or write in her own language, never mind ours. In addition, if she's got kids with disabilities, and we've had this very situation happen, her track is going to be completely different than an Iraqi engineer who's been working with the U.S. Army Corps, knows English before he gets here, you know, has a sense of what to expect. His track is going to look very different. His employment will look very different. Hers may take 2 years to really fundamentally get on her feet. His might be 3 months. And the problem is that the system, the way it's structured, ignores all of that. It says, I don't care who you are, you get the same amount of money, you have the same amount of time, regardless of where you're starting from, And we have a certain amount of time to teach you English, to get you a job, and it doesn't really matter what your starting condition is or where what path you have to take. So from the community standpoint, some of these ones that are more challenging really could benefit from community circles or whatever language you want to use, of people wrapping around to help them bridge that sometimes longer gap, depending on what they're doing. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I just wanted to add that asylum seekers in the United States, in contrast to in Europe, are eligible for no public benefits. In the EU countries, once someone has filed an application for asylum, they become eligible for some at least minimal financial and housing support from the state. There's really nothing here. So many asylum seekers my program have encountered have really gone through periods of economic destitution and have to depend on homeless shelters or whatever community supports they can find in their local sort of ethnic or immigrant communities. There are some programs here and there, like in Worcester, the Hadwin Park Congregational Church has an organized program to provide financial support and assistance to LGBT asylum seekers. And hopefully more projects like that will emerge over time. But one thing that people could do to support immigrants who, from Connecticut, who wind up in immigration detention, many of whom may have asylum claims, is to support efforts to get people out on bond. In New Haven, there is now a community bond fund that I believe is part of the New Haven Foundation. If you look online for the New Haven Foundation Community Bond Fund, you can probably find information about this Community Immigration Bond Fund. And that's designed to help family members get people out of immigration detention. And if you can get them out of immigration detention, they have a much better chance of finding some way to legally remain in the United States. The other thing that people might want to keep an eye out for are particular cases where making noise can make a difference. Recently, you may have read in the newspapers about Luis Barrios, someone from who had been in the United States for decades. He was well regarded in the community, had U.S. citizen children. He, however, was under an old order of deportation, which under the previous administration, ICE was willing to give him stays of deportation, but ICE under this administration announced they were going to deport him. And it took a lot of public agitation, intervention by the congressional delegation, and a lot of concerted effort to publicize it, to get ICE to change their mind about that. And if you want to be on the lookout for cases like that where publicity and making a statement can make a difference, a good source for that is if you get on the email list of Connecticut Students for a Dream. They do a wonderful job of publicizing cases in Connecticut of people who have gotten into trouble with immigration and need help.
You may wonder why people have old deportation or removal orders. So somebody comes in and they're issued, and the Border Patrol, goes over their whole thing, and basically says they've come here to God knows where to meet with mom and get a job or something. And then they're issued something called a notice to appear, which is, of course, is in English. The notice to appear may or may not have an address. It may or may not have a court date. It usually says something like court date to be determined. Depending on where they came into the United States, they could be assigned to a court in Miami. They would have absolutely no idea what court they are assigned to. They would have absolutely no idea what you could do. So we have these people, they come into our office, And we know that they've come up to New Jersey. However, they're not in what's called not in the system. They're not, haven't been issued, that is, the notices to appear have not yet been served on the court. So you go to the court and you want to be able to represent this person. You cannot enter a notice of appearance until they've been already put into court system, because the system doesn't allow you to do that. You cannot change their addresses so that they will ever even get the notice. You see how everything works against the immigrant. The other thing you need to know is that immigration is what's called a civil action. It is not a criminal action. There are no rights to public defenders. Everybody in immigration court is allowed to pick an attorney at their own cost. We're going through a battle right now in the Third Circuit in New Jersey. We're hoping, being led by one of the circuit judges who wants to set up a program, a pro bono program for people in detention, because only less than 20% of the people in detention get attorneys. And that's a real problem. Private immigration attorneys are expensive. And then there are the notarios. Now, these people are the scum of the earth. Agreed, okay. They are the people who sit along the road, they have these little chop shops, and they offer, quote, immigration advice, pictures, passports, in the back room. You could probably find a fake green card or two. But these people are the absolute scum of the earth, because what they do is they give all of this bad information. They make people sign statements and sign documents. They have no idea what they're signing. And then what happens is they end up either in a court or they end up in an office somewhere, and they have absolutely no idea what they signed, because all the documents, of course, are in English. And because the notario, or the immigration agent in non-Spanish speaking groups, primarily Eastern European, has not really explained exactly what it is that they're signing. They just took the money. Fortunately, one of our more notorious immigration notarios is now spending her next 10 years as a guest of the U.S. government, because she defrauded, she was sued, actually, of the state government. The U.S. government wouldn't bring the charge. The state government in the county, Union County, New Jersey, they just convicted Maritza Chavez of 28 counts of immigration fraud, $230,000, not bad, and divide that by 28, and she's spending 10 years in jail. But rarely does that happen. Rarely does it happen. And sometimes, unfortunately, some of these notarios and some of these agents masquerade as religious people and clergy. So when somebody tells you they've gone to see somebody, the first thing you want to see is you want to see an ESQ after that person's name. You want to make sure that it's an attorney at law that they talk to, or an accredited representative, which is a person who's been given the right to represent somebody, the responsibility to represent somebody in immigration court after taking a course and working under the supervision of a lawyer. It's really, really important that they get the right kind of representation, or they could really end up in a lot of bad trouble. That's why all these people have old removal orders. You wonder, like, why? Well, they never went to court. Of course they never went to court. They were never notified.
Thank you very much. We're going to take a break for 15 minutes for Robert prayers. So those who want to avail themselves of the chapel that is open for prayers at this time. And we'll come back in 10 minutes or so, 8:30, we have a couple more questions related to ICE, and another one related to what can we do, and then we'll have some final thoughts, okay?
You must have a great human rights clinic. I envy you.
That we honor the prayer cycle, and we take time out for prayer in chapel in the evening. So I have two more questions from the floor, and then we'll wrap it up here. So this one is particularly related to ICE. Someone has asked, is it helpful for people of faith and others to accompany families seeking asylum, or hold vigils at ICE offices? Are these helpful things for them to do? Engage in moments of sanctuary or activities of accompanying?
You You just went through this whole thing.
Yeah.
Yes, what ICE does not like is a lot of publicity about their rotten behavior. You see, I'm very neutral on my point of view here. What ICE doesn't like is a lot of, especially newspaper and publicity and what have you. So families, people of faith, we have, I would say there's at least one vigil a week in front of the federal building in New Jersey. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's also very helpful to have people of faith accompany people to what they call check-ins. People who either have old orders or who are getting ready to be scheduled for court usually have what are called check-ins. They go in maybe once every couple of months and they check in with ICE, and ICE makes sure, you know, they kind of make them wait around a half a day, and then they tell them to come back in another couple of months. They're going on there while their case is being processed. It's helpful to have somebody with them at that point for a couple of reasons. First, because then ICE recognizes this person is not alone, and that really makes a difference. The agent recognizes that there's somebody else there, and there's somebody else who can, is not a lawyer, will not accompany them inside, but they see that the person is with them. That's very helpful. People of faith should make it very clear. The other thing that's important about people in faith, they should make it very clear what's going on. You know, the newspapers love letters. I mean, you really should consider, advocacy is a public act. And advocacy means you ought to write letters, you ought to call people, you ought to make sure that everybody understands what's going on. That's really, really, really important. So I think it is very helpful for that. Sometimes you need to pull out all the troops, like the congressional delegation that blocked the most recent deportation. We've had senators and bishops show up at the ICE office, and that person is still here. And usually it's because it was an old deport order that came from an old notice to appear.
Just very briefly, I agree with all that, but part of the question, if I heard it right, was acts of sanctuary. And I just want to say something about that. You know, many of you are probably familiar with the sanctuary movement of the 1980s, which did very important work. But one thing to be clear about it is if you get involved with actively shielding someone from immigration agents in terms of trying to hide them, it is illegal conduct. It's conduct for which you can be prosecuted. Some church people in Texas were successfully prosecuted, although they didn't do any time in prison. Acts of witness, acts of support are perfectly legal, hugely important. If you're considering, having a church give sanctuary to someone with the purpose of shielding them from getting picked up from immigration, seek some legal advice, make sure you know what you're getting into, and you may still decide to do it as an act of civil disobedience, but you should, do that knowingly rather than accidentally.
Another little tidbit about ICE. Recently, ICE, I don't know the details, but ICE came to arrest some people who were illegal, and they, going back to her point, is that they don't want to publicize that they are ICE, so they just had blazers that said police on them.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so then the chief of police told us when he came to the CREA meeting that he categorically told them that, look, you cannot just say police, because then the community thinks it's us, and we have to work with the community and help the community. And he got an assurance from them that in future, the police can't stop them doing whatever it is they're doing, but they should at least specify and wear blazers that say ICE. So that's taken care of.
When ICE knocks at the door, you do not have to open it. But once you open it, you let them in. I tell all my clients, if you think that's ICE, don't open the door. They need a warrant. and no ICE officer goes out and gets a warrant. You do not need to open the door. I'm sorry? That's right. They come at great hours, like, 5 o'clock in the morning, and, when they expect they're gonna get people asleep. And then there's what's called the collateral damage, like in bombing. Well, there's collateral damage in pickups. They'll come in looking for one person, and then the whole house turns out to be unauthorized. And sure, they're here without status, and the whole house gets put into proceedings, or arrested, or depending on what their past immigration history has been, they could be put into detention.
This question is really for Diana and Angela. How do you navigate these issues, being a faith-based organization in a very politically dominated and controlled system?
With us at Catholic Charities, we are officially not allowed to assist undocumented people. So if they come to me, for instance, they call me up and say, my husband has been detained by ICE, and please, can you help? I don't know what to do. Can you help my husband? And I have to, unfortunately, very politely tell them that, I'm not in a position to do that, and I would give them the name of perhaps a pro bono lawyer or a legal association to contact.
So are you talking about refugees or undocumented, or both?
I think this is the issues.
It's the broader question about
Yeah.
how do we do refugee and immigrant services in a politicized environment?
Well,
Right.
and be a religious organization.
I was referring to the undocumented, of course.
So I think it is tricky. We've taken a much more active role in advocacy than we ever have. Historically, certainly Lutheran organizations have been sort of quiet, and we just do our work, and nobody says anything to anybody, and you just do good things, which actually, to your point earlier, hasn't helped us much. We should have been much louder. But what's been really tough, let me be candid, is that, and we've been challenged, this is how I ended up here, right? Reverend Grafton knows this, because I actually challenged it on an email when we were talking about the religious basis for doing this type of work. It's pretty clear that we're called to do this. That's not in question. The Christian theology, certainly, actually all of them do. Welcome the stranger, and Christ himself was a stranger. So if you're in the Christian faith, you can't even argue with me that there's no, theological basis for doing this work. And yet, we were having this conversation with Carl a few minutes ago, there's a huge gap between what we're called to do and what the pastors know to be true and what the Pew data tells us about what's going on in the pews themselves. And this I have heartburn about, because to me, it's an atrocity that somehow what we're called to do, and the pastors are not necessarily taking a really proactive, this is unacceptable role with people in the congregations, talking about this more aggressively. I think they're concerned or worried about creating discomfort or whatever the word might be in the congregation itself. And that's been difficult because, to be honest, I said to some of the pastors recently, I said, we are more the church than you are right now, because we are called to be the church, not just hide in our little sanctuary of 4 walls and a steeple and pretend that, when we're inside here, we know what the Bible says, and we don't have to go live it out. But we do need to go live it out. So what we're finding more recently is we're getting much louder and much more active in teaching, educating, encouraging, having tougher conversations with pastors and ministries about, if you want to be in this work, then you need to be brave and courageous and stand up to this atrocity that's going on out here. This shouldn't look like this. And the fact that we're all sitting here, we're complicit in this mess because we're not standing up to it. And this is an opportunity, frankly, in my opinion, for the church to stand up and lead instead of sit back and watch. But I think it's an interesting place to be in social ministry right now, because we're right in between, the sort of the standard church as it was, and government and civil relations and all these things. And you can see both sides. You can see how this has happened. and yet we're not willing to face it, and that makes me nuts. And so we've had some interesting and tough conversations, but, you know, people like you just said, great, come on up.
You know, there was something,
All the emails that you sent.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Just if I could just say something real quick and then we'll go to you. Related to this, I wanted to go back to Dr. Wilson's keynote in terms of, you know, in Europe, he made the comment of the shift to the right of political parties and how it's only logical then that we would have members of churches that are a part of that. So in this country, as pastors know here, you know, you've got members of both parties in these congregations, and however they're responding, they're obviously not responding to the needs of the time.
Well, I think that we can be much louder and much more brave than we've ever been right now, and that there's still a hesitation. I mean, we're lucky to live in New England, let me just say that. Really lucky. And Massachusetts in general, New Hampshire too, are easier states to work in than some of the states across the U.S. We're very blessed. We see some really heavy anti-refugee legislation going through in all kinds of other states. But in New England, we have the opportunity to lead and show how it can be done, both at the church level and at the social ministry level. And I think it's our obligation to do it, and do it loud and proud. And so it's just an interesting time to be in this place. And so anybody that's up in this region of the country, I think we have an obligation beyond what we've done so far.
there was something called the 60s. I don't know how many of you remember the 60s.
The what? What did she say?
Some of us are old enough to have lived them. Okay, so there was something called the 60s, and if you look at those old pictures, you'll see that, you know, Martin Luther King wasn't by himself. He was with clergy, and they were in collars, and they were in suits, and they were marching with him. And something happened around 1970, and I think it was more than just Kent State, but something in the whole atmosphere changed. People and pastors backed off after that period of the 60s, and pastors should not be backing off. I mean, I didn't see Jesus backing off too much, and maybe we don't all want to hang on a cross, but the point is that we, you know, the call to us as Christians, the call to people who are Jews, the call to people who are Muslims, every single religion says you welcome the stranger. There's a law of asylum in Islam, there's a law of asylum in Judaism, and there's a law of asylum in Christianity, and there's no excuse for any pastor to sit around and mealy-mouth his way through or her way through, you know, this time. This is the time. This is the time. There's no question.
Can you tell us how you really feel?
Yeah, that's right. I'm so quiet and back. And for pastors, by the way, I'm going to do a workshop Wednesday morning. If you want to learn a little bit more about how you can be helpful, this is a nuts and bolts workshop, immigration, what you can do kind of thing.